Hello everyone, my name is Kong Shrinani and welcome to my YouTube channel NeuroChat with AG. On this channel, I plan to cover topics that are closest to my heart and support the neurodiverse community. Topics related to neurodiversity, autism, late autism diagnosis, and autism in women and girls. I will interview thought leaders, esteemed researchers, scientists, professors, doctors, and psychologists and seek their views and updates on their latest work and research. I will also chat with parents of neurodiverse kids and adults and talk about experiences of neurodiverse individuals. Lastly, keeping inclusivity as a topmost priority. We might also discuss controversial disparate views for a collective understanding of issues and respect for diverse views. All the views and topics discussed are for informational purposes only. If you are interested in watching more quality content on this topic, please hit the subscribe button. Don't forget to press the bell icon to be notified whenever a new video is uploaded. Please also share the channel with your friends, family, and social media platforms. Thank you. Mr. Uday Kiran Bolusani is an accomplished investment operations leader and a prominent advocate known as the Autistic Leader. With a career marked by excellence in investment operations, he combines his expertise with a deep commitment to advancing neuro-inclusive leadership practices. Recognizing the unique perspectives and strengths that neurodivergent individuals bring to the workplace, Mr. Bolusani actively promotes strategies to make leadership and organizational structures more inclusive and supportive of neurodiverse talent. His work is shaping a new model for leadership, one that values diversity of thought and promotes the full inclusion of neurodivergent individuals in all aspects of professional life. Mr. Bolusani, welcome and thank you very much for the time today.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
And to jump right into it, could you share a bit about your personal journey and when you were diagnosed?
Yeah, no, I appreciate you asking. So it's interesting. I am very late diagnosed. There's definitely people who've been late diagnosed at a later stage in life than myself as well. But I'm 39 today. I was diagnosed in February of 2024, so earlier this year. The journey to that diagnosis process is also a multi-year journey, right? So there was discussions that were occurring when at my last company. I actually had this opportunity to have a therapist, right? So, there's mental health, well-being type opportunities and benefits that companies offer today. So I had the luxury in that sense to have that, without necessarily going through the official, hey, there's something wrong process, right? In order to get a mental health professional, just to kind of almost like preventative care, let's call it, right? There was lots of different things going on personally and professionally at the time, and thought, it's a great time to use this benefit that I have. And it was interesting as I went through the process, and certain life things were also getting a lot more stressful in general, both personally and professionally. The discussions, especially going back to my early childhood, and a lot of my life experiences started to come to light. And so it actually ended up being where that specific therapist referred me to a more specialist who's a PhD, because that individual only had a master's degree. Then I worked with this PhD therapist for approximately a year and a half, and that's where the idea really started to come out, right? Because there are certain things like, is it possible that you have anxiety and other things that the master's degree therapist was talking about? And as we talked about it with the PhD therapist, and then my wife also kind of mentioned something to me like, have you ever considered that this, might be autism, and so with a combination of those conversations with my therapist, we ended up actually deciding at the end, I think it was around mid or early 2023, to say, are you interested in kind of going through a formal process to explore this further, right, from a diagnostic lens? So 2023 really kind of spent the time working to figure out what that looks like. Do I need that? I think a lot of people today are familiar, or if they're not, right, worth noting that getting a diagnosis can be expensive, right? It's often not covered by insurance unless it's kind of one of those very evident, right? So under the diagnostic process for ASD, autism spectrum disorder, level 1 is often private pay. In that sense, in the US at least. So I had some decisions to make, and I did decide to move forward with the formal process, found an amazing diagnostician who has been doing a lot of research, working with Yale, and specialized actually in adult diagnosis, especially where there wasn't a co-occurring intellectual disability. So that ultimately culminated in February 2024 with the diagnosis of level 1 autism spectrum disorder without intellectual disability. And I also have a CPTSD, complex post-traumatic stress disorder.
So, how do you think your life changed once you got that diagnosis?
Yeah, it's a great question. I've got depending on people's knowledge, very mixed responses, right? So there's people who are like, "Wow, like I'm so glad that you got that insight," which is how I feel, right? But of course, based on stigmas and a whole bunch of other um, lack of information or education or awareness on the topic, there's also the oh my God, I'm so sorry. I've also had the question like, okay, like, is there a cure? Like, how do you heal? And so it's been an interesting journey to not only know for myself, right, that this is where I think like the medical model and the social model and the diagnosis process versus the neurodiversity paradigm all come together, right? So for me, it's been a really, really helpful self-reflection, right? So like I really believe in the concept of Hansei, Hansei, which is the Japanese art of self-reflection. And it's part of like, from a business lens, Kaizen and continuous improvement. But it goes deeper, right? And what this has allowed me to do is really hold that principle. Because I know myself in a way that I would have never known before, or I would have not known otherwise. And honestly, it's like having answers to a whole bunch of unanswered questions, missing gaps, right? Where there were possible answers, but there was always something missing. Like the things never fully made sense. And I can now go back to things when I was the age of 5, the age of 6, that I can trace back to. That's what was going on, right? That I was never able to explain to myself before.
So, regarding that as a child, what are your views on early intervention for children on the spectrum? And could you relate this to your personal experience?
It's a very interesting question and one that I don't have any perfect answers, right? I myself grew up. I'm Indian by ethnicity, right? So I didn't necessarily grow up in a culture or community that thought about mental health as a preventative, positive thing, right? Mental health in general has a huge stigma, right? So I think there's a, I will say, compound question of complexity here for me, right? I hope that the future, which I do see occurring, is filled with less pathologizing information, right? Where children aren't stigmatized and shunned by their peers, their schools. And as we do that, the concept of quote unquote early intervention probably has more power, right? Because we're approaching it from the right lens of acceptance and understanding differences, which I think that paradigm is occurring in the world. So in that sense, I think, there is a lot of opportunity. Because I myself didn't experience what that's like as a child, I don't have, and I don't have a lot of experience like you do, Akanksha. What is it like to interact with children with autism as well? So it's a tough one for me because I don't know what I don't know, so I'm not willing to speculate in that sense, right? I also know that I've talked to plenty of caregivers. I've talked to people who have been diagnosed throughout their life, right, and grew up to be adults, and I've had great conversations. But I only have those third party perspectives in terms of what it means to be a child with autism and what does that mean in the future. So I have high hopes in terms of long term, uh, to your word usage, early interventions, but I hope those interventions are more about acceptance, understanding the concept that I call strategic masking, which is really kind of identifying what is the best way for you as an individual to be your authentic self and finding that balance in the world, right? Instead of just having to fully hide who you are, which really, really hurts in a lot of ways, right? And find that balance of other people around you, right? That relational concept, but having that include accepting who you are naturally.
As an autistic leader, um, How has your neurodivergence influenced your approach to leadership and decision making?
Yeah, it's a really good question, right? And this is where I'm looking to make sure that I myself am carving out a little bit of a niche because I don't think there's enough conversation or even understanding about what it means to be neurodivergent when it comes to leadership. So this was something that I posted on my page, but I'm just going to quickly, it's a post that kind of lays out, and it's a quote by Bennis W.G., and he had a paper called "On Becoming a Leader," which was published in 2009. And it says, leadership is the most studied and least understood topic of any in the social sciences. And never have so many labored so long to say so little. And the reason that's really, really important, because leadership as theory has evolved significantly, right? So there was a great man theory in the 1840s, and that came from things like the war generals and like the kings and the queens, and like you have to be this amazing, great natural man specifically, right? To be a leader, right? That was a time of very different world of who had rights, right? Women didn't have rights, right? So leaders were very, very siloed to a very specific, you must be great already in order to be the leader. That eventually gave way to the trait theories in the 1930s and 1940s, which then gave way to the behavioral theories, which is one of the things that impacts how the behaviors of neurodivergents, including autistics, are impacted today. So that behavioral theory phase, 1940s, 1950s, is still accepted today, right? So the trait theories, personality trait, is used to some extent. Great man theory is not really, that's been debunked, right? So you're not just a natural born leader. There's a science to leadership, right? And art that you can learn. And then there's situational leadership, situational theories, right? And there's transactional, that was the 1960s, and then transactional and transformational theories of leadership, which goes back to the latest of 1990s and 2000s. So I really believe that neuro inclusion will reshape yet again how we think about leadership. Because if you think about, for example, traits, right? What we're saying is personality traits, these are unchangeable. But is certain traits like let's use autistic leaders, right? Because that's the lens that I have. If you are struggling with change, is that where it's called rigidity? Does that mean that you don't have the right personality trait to be a leader? I would challenge that because under the existing pathologizing model, people would say, yeah, you don't have the right personality because you struggle with change, and leaders have to fundamentally deal with change, right? But that being said, there are many, many components that make that change difficult for autistic individuals. And speaking specifically for those level one type autistics, without intellectual disability, that might be, right? It's a very narrow population that's in existing organizations today, right? That are masking to an extent. Often what that population is missing is information and the ability to discuss that information without emotional judgment, right? So that change and actually guiding that change is very, very possible. In fact, with some of the strengths that come with being autistic, such as pattern recognition, identifying risks, you can actually drive that change better because that idea of creating systems and routines, you can use that to say, how do we accomplish the change in a measured way? Right? If you think about situational theories, right? Situational theories or behavioral theories say, well, let's talk about direct communication. Well, when is that appropriate, right? So situational theories is where emotional intelligence often comes into play. And then from a behavioral perspective, that's where communication styles come into play, right? So people will say, well, that direct communication, are you considering the situation of how that makes someone feel? But again, let's talk about theory of mind for a moment, right? So today you have authors like Brene Brown and Speaker who talk about vulnerability. So really, is it a question of avoiding the hard conversation? And we call that emotional intelligence because you're anticipating someone's bad reaction, emotionally. That is how we think about behavioral theory and situational theory. But the reality is, emotions are not a result of someone's actions, they're a result of your brain, right? Now, others' actions are created meaning in your brain, and that meaning may be right and it may be wrong. So, how are we making sure we have that conversation? How are we making sure that we take those perspectives? How are we using vulnerability to give voice to what's happening? And what are the different perspectives that different people are taking in order to get to where they are? That's leadership. And that's the leadership, especially when we're no longer in the factory industrial era, right? We're in this knowledge era and moving to the conceptual era. It's all about ideas. So you can't get to how did people come up with the ideas or the thought processes and really honor that diversity of thought if you don't talk about what's happening inside, right? And I think so. I do believe those norms, have this opportunity to change as that recognition occurs.
Could you describe a personal experience in which your neurodivergent perspective helped you solve a leadership challenge or achieve a unique outcome?
Yeah, no, I've had numerous over the years, right? So my special interests, which is why I ended up in investment operations, just happened to be things like finance and law, right? So I really like complex finance and I really like complex law and I like the intersection of what those things mean that creates understanding, how does the market structure work? How does the internal structure work, right? So all of those complex systems coming together, right? That's what my autistic brain finds fascinating, right? So as a result of bringing those special interests and the ability to really systemize and routines, right? I've identified significant risks in various organizations that I've worked at, brought those to the surface, which have resulted in millions and millions of dollars of savings over the years, right? Creating new organizational structures, creating new processes, turning that into system asks, right? And making sure that we're saying, hey, here's how the world's evolving. A simple example without getting into too much confidential details, right? Is very recently with the war in Ukraine, right? The US Treasury issued sanctions. It's a fundamental part of how we make sure that financial warfare, aka preventing, funding, to bad actors, that the U.S. Treasury undertakes, and that's called sanctions law, right? So I recently had the opportunity to identify some of those implications, right? From an industry lens, and had that conversation with numerous major trillion-dollar players, right? So the large banks, the large asset managers, and we talked about what does that mean from an operational lens and how do we work with our compliance teams and our legal teams and our trading teams to make sure that we're mitigating this extremely increased exponential risk in the space. While the concept's been around for a very long time, the amount and the volume and the implication to the financial industry has significantly changed with recent Russian sanctions laws, right? So that's been probably one of the most rewarding aspects to be able to connect those dots together to mitigate those kind of impacts.
What are the most significant challenges that neurodivergent individuals face at workplaces, and how can organizations create those more inclusive opportunities?
Yeah, it's an amazing question, and different organizations are at very different places with this, right? So, it comes back to how do we think about inclusion and belonging, right? So, neurodivergence is a type of diversity, right? But it's more than just your individual diagnosis per se, right? What we're really trying to get at is diversity of thought. Now, neurodivergence gives you diversity of thought fundamentally because your actual brain structure, your brain chemistry is different than the neuromajority. But we also know that neuroplasticity is impacted by lived experiences, right? So this diversity of thought and embracing that is the next phase of how organizations need to think. And the reason that's important is because by nature, the brain makes very quick assumptions and judgments, right? Which is interesting because the autistic brain with the bottom up processing is less likely to do this, right? So this is where the need for clarification of questions, right? Which sometimes organizational leaders might say, are you questioning my authority? But really what's happening is bottom up processing, right? Let's actually remove the bias and remove the quick judgments, right? I'm not saying that the feelings and intuition may not be valid, but how do we bring those to the surface and explore how we got there, right? That's the type of behavioral concept that folks have gotten a quick association. If you are being direct and asking questions, then you must be questioning my authority. And these are the dynamics that occur at the senior leadership level, often in organizations, right? And it's because leaders And these organizations are dealing with volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity. We call that VUCA, VUCA, right? And that means that there's a lot of decision making, a lot of risk, a lot of responsibility sitting on those leaders' shoulders, right? But what happens often is that's being left unsaid, right? So there's all of these underlying, potentially unconscious decisions, behaviors, judgments, associations occurring because folks are desperately trying to make sure that they make the right decision, that the responsibility that sits on their shoulders, right, that they're upholding that. So it comes from a good place. But if organizations don't recognize that giving voice to those things, right, and having that conversation, really embracing diversity of thought so you can make the best decisions, articulate how to make those best decisions, who makes those decisions, what are your decision making processes, right? Defining those things is the future of neuro-inclusive leadership, right? And that allows a level playing field of various minds to sit in those leadership tables.
And you mentioned this earlier, but neurodivergent strengths like pattern recognition and problem solving skills can be and should be leveraged in workplaces. So can you, talk a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, so fundamentally in business, in any organization, there's going to be risks, right? There's various kinds of, there's geopolitical risk, there could be market risk, there could be operational risk. There's, depending on the nature of business, there's a whole bunch of those concepts. You cannot design operational processes. You cannot really identify what is causing your business strategic gaps, right, that you need to address without being able to really take in the data. So there's lots of people that really specialize and can add a lot of value in this space, right? And let's say that you're a lawyer and you need to identify, right, what is the right argument and how do you sift through what seems like very different details, right? That type of pattern recognition, right, for example, helps to drive that further, right? Does that mean that the neuromajority that may not have that same quote unquote strength the neurodivergent has can't do that? Of course not. That's a strength that, can exist across the board. But there's a natural component as well that enhances that, right? So it's important to recognize, just like any ability, there are going to be certain people who have a natural ability to perform a specific type of task, or right. So if you're a basketball player, right, your ability to dribble, right, there could be a natural version. You see this with children, but can it be practiced and honed? And the person who practices beyond that natural ability be able to also take that further? Absolutely, right. So is it possible that a neuro majority person hones the skill of that pattern recognition analysis further than the neurodivergent? 100%. But can that neurodivergent person who's already got that head start in this sense, it has that privilege of having that that ability naturally, also further hone that? Absolutely. And that's an amazing benefit to organizations. And thinking about what are the roles? How do we use these skill sets? How do we design the right organizational role to really leverage these strengths? Right? There's a huge opportunity there.
How do you think organizations can create more inclusive workplace cultures that empower all individuals?
I think it really, really comes to your values and living your values. So there's an amazing professor, Ed Schein. He's known often as the father of organizational psychology at MIT. And he has this pyramid, and it's 3 layers. So you have artifacts. So, let's say on a website, here's our values, here's who we are as a firm. Within that is beneath that artifact is the espoused values. In theory, the things that your leaders and the people in your organization are saying should match what's listed as your value, as from an artifact perspective. There are times where that's not the case, right? And so you already have some sort of gap, and that needs to be filled. But where the biggest gap often lies is between the espoused values and the tacit assumptions, right? So this is an interesting one because especially for autistics, this is where those social cues and those unsaid social rules get impacted. So if your value, for example, is we should always have the conversation, even if it's difficult. Let's say that's a value that's on your artifact as well as your espoused values. One of the unsaid assumptions might be, well, that's great, but you don't do that when you're talking to a senior leader in the organization. right? And that may be commonly assumed, that might call the tacit assumption, and that might be how people operate. Or there might be a rule, unsaid social rule, let's call it, that says, yes, you do that, but you only do it in private where nobody else knows that's happening, right? And if we think it should be published further or broadcasted further, then we'll determine how and when other people will find out that this conversation happened, right? That is an underlying assumption and rule that seems like it's technically aligned to the artifact and the espoused value of let's have the hard discussion, right? But there's a lot of hidden assumptions, and these are the kind of things that really make um, organizations get stuck in, are we living our values and truly designing the culture that we want, right? So this next phase of inclusion, this next phase of organizational belonging is going to go into really being able to say, what are those assumptions that we're making that we may not even realize today are assumptions? And by giving voice and writing those assumptions and doing that analysis of what are those assumptions that are technically not completely embodying our values that are written and being said, we will be able to break that barrier to belonging for everyone.
How do you identify leadership potential in neurodivergent individuals who may not fit traditional, neuromajority leadership expectations?
Yeah, there's this amazing quote that I came across recently, and it talks about the literate of the future, and that the literate of the future are those who can unlearn, relearn different concepts, right? So I think honestly, that's the basis for the future of identifying leadership potential, right? Are we so stuck in our judgments and our assumptions of what leadership looks like that we're not willing to look at the science that's evolving, the organizational psychology that's evolving, the diverse voices that are given, that are showing, and use cases as well, right? There's companies, and it's very obvious, that take very, very different approaches, and they're successful even with very different approaches to organizational norms. So that tells you that objectively, there isn't necessarily a right leadership behavior. It's what we accept as the right norm, right? So I think that type of recognition and identifying people who are willing to really hone that skill, identify those assumptions, like I said, have the conversation, right? And really change the dynamic of influence. Influence being not who has the most power and therefore how do I convince you, but influence being who is willing to have the conversation and really normalize the level of power, right? Treat people as equals, treat people as valued, right? That doesn't mean everyone has decision making status, right? But being able to know how to have that conversation and how to bring people to the table and value them, I think that's how you identify leadership potential in the future.
As someone who has experience in technology and organizational psychology, what advice would you give to leaders looking to drive innovation and inclusivity?
Yeah. So just for full clarity, I'm not a technology professional. I'm an operations professional. So as a result, I've definitely worked with technology leaders and peers, and have to also be up on that to that point. I think innovation really, and it's interesting because innovation requires diversity of thought, right? Being able to have very different perspectives is how you drive innovation. I always love using the concept of like Velcro as an example. Velcro was created based on like a need for the International Space Station, if I recall, right, from NASA, and then that turned into the Velcro product that we all know today. And there's so many examples of this, right? You don't always know where an idea is going to come from and how that solution might come. In fact, one of the best examples, there's a power company in Canada who was having this issue where the weather was getting so bad that their entire power lines were getting snow and ice, and it was getting very, very expensive. Their customers were unhappy because power lines kept going down, power kept going out. They had to get a lot of crew. So they started to brainstorm, and all of their professional leaders, right, in the organization with expertise in the power markets, couldn't come up with solutions that would necessarily solve the problem with, in a cost efficient way. So what occurred is they brought an organizational psychologist, a management consultant in, and they had diverse people at the table, right? So customer centered, the people who weren't experts, but who worked in the organization from various departments. And they had them sit in a room and said, here's the problem. And one of the conversations ended up leading to, we have so many bears, and imagine if we just put some honey on top of the power poles and the bears will climb them. And as they climb them, the snow and ice will shake off, right? Seems really, really silly. Obviously, that's not a realistic solution, but that triggered a light bulb moment, and someone else in that same conversation as a result said, well, there's all of these money that we spend on helicopters, right? For these executives to get around. That's just a waste of money. Can they redivert that money? So those two conversations ended up coming together, and what they actually ended up doing was realize early in the storm, if they can fly the helicopter over the power lines, the wind created from the blades gets rid of the snow from the power lines. So they had a preventative measure, and that actually ended up saving a lot of money. It's actually one of my favorite stories about how that innovation and diversity of thought concept comes together, and where you might have ideas that come up with a solution that you would never otherwise think of.
In your work, how do you address the misconception that neurodivergent individuals lack the leadership traits that are usually associated with senior roles?
Yeah. Let's be honest, right? This is work that is going to take much longer time, right? So I don't have a perfect answer. I don't have a perfect solution. It's going to continue to be things like this, the work that you're doing, Akanksha, in terms of your YouTube channel, right? And the people that you're interviewing to really bring the information, the awareness from voices that are in that space, right? That have that inner experience, that inner knowledge, right? So that folks who are ready to hear it also start becoming allies and it spreads, right? Just like anything, and we see this in product adoption, there's a curve. On the front end of the curve, you have early adopters, and that's where we are with neurodiversity and neurodivergence and neuroinclusion today, right? Those early adopters, right? As those increase, you go further down to the curve where it's now the average, right? We've seen this with other marginalized identities, right? And the timeline looks very different, right? Women, right? Let's talk about women's suffrage, right? And Susan B. Anthony, right? She went to jail for advocating for women to vote, right? We would not question that she is a hero, right? But at the time, legally, she was a troublemaker, right? We saw that with race. We will continue to see this across dimensions. We saw that with LGBTQ, right? You would never in the 90s think that people will be out and open. In fact, one of the examples I like to use is the Diagnostic Statistic Manual. Up until 1973, considered being gay a disorder. In fact, you could get diagnosed with that disorder, which is where things like conversion therapy and other things came from. You wouldn't even come close to having that conversation today. And if you did, and you called it a disorder, everyone would know that you who are saying that, if someone was saying that, are someone who needs to be educated or on the wrong side of history, right? That shift has occurred. Another example is until 2013, trans people, right? It was a disorder that you could get diagnosed with. That changed in 2013 to an informed consent model so that they can get the required medical approaches that they need to be truly who they are. And that informed consent model significantly changed that dynamic. So I use those examples because I think there is this type of shift occurring in the world, and it's going to take time. It's going to take advocates. It's going to take the conscious of the world who are bringing those advocates to a platform, right, to give voice to those things.
Thank you for all the compliments. You've also mentioned a vision of elevating neurodivergent individuals to senior leadership roles and board positions. So, you know, what steps can organizations take today to shift their leadership pipelines to be more inclusive of neurodivergent talent?
Yeah, I think we talked a lot about these things already so far. The inspiration for this actually is not solely my own. Professor Charlotte Velour, is one of my inspirations for this specific mission when it comes to leadership and board positions. She has already started to pave the way with the Institute of Neurodiversity. I believe it's called ION. It's been interesting for me to kind of figure out what does that look like, right? And how do we bring that awareness? And it's something that I want to really make headway on, because not only does it help those who want to be in those positions, but when we have the representation in those positions, the overall landscape of unemployment, right, and underemployment that really exists for the neurodivergent community, and especially the autistic community, should change significantly, right? Which is generally what we see when we start to bring those marginalized identities into those senior positions. The decision making looks different in those organizations as a result.
What changes do you hope to see in the corporate world over the next 5 to 10 years regarding neurodivergent representation in leadership and decision making?
Yeah, there is a great model by Deloitte that looks at what does the evolution of diversity and inclusion look like in an organization, right? So on the beginning end, you have a very legal and compliance approach, right? Which then moves to we're going to create this centralized large program related to diversity and inclusion, which a lot of organizations have also started to do. And we're seeing some of that shift with the current political landscape. Then you move to this integrated where different business units and divisions are also driving that beyond the centralized broad program. And then you have this kind of normalization state where it's just the nature of the organization, how it behaves, right? So here, Ludmila Proslova in the Canary Code talks about various companies like Divergent as an example, and some others that have done this. I believe, what's the something knots? Forget the name of the Ultranauts, or I believe it might be Ultranauts, if I recall. But these are the types of really, really integrated organizations that where it's just the norm to think about it this way. So I think that is what's ahead, that paradigm and that understanding, and really shifting beyond what do the disability laws in your states, in your countries say, right? Which is often where neurodivergence are being really addressed from, right? And so it's very diagnostic specific. It's not based on diversity of thought. It's not based on, let's really shift away from that legal liability and think about how can this help our organization from a real talent perspective. And I think that shift, as it starts to occur, which is occurring in some organizations, again, we have those early adopters. As we normalize that, the landscape will shift, in my opinion.
And is there anything else you'd like to share with our audience?
Yeah, no, I don't have anything else. I think these have been some amazing questions. I'm definitely thankful for the opportunity to be on your channel, and there are some amazing voices that are real pioneers in this space that you've already had. So to be among that group of people, and to be interviewed by someone who's also so passionate, already making headway in this space, is an honor of mine personally. I just want to say that I know that you said that those compliments aren't something that's easy for you, but I truly believe that you are making and leading in this space, and that's important. That's really important, and I love that.
Thank you. Mr. Bolusani, thank you, first for your compliments, and but also really thank you for taking the time to, share your insights and experiences. Those like perspectives you have on your inclusive leadership and, creating those supportive environments, is really inspiring. And, I think your work is paving the way for a lot of meaningful change. So
I appreciate
thank you.
that. Thank you.